Real briefly, Tom is Minister Provincial of the Sacred Heart Province of the Franciscans, headquartered right here in Little Old St. Louis. Prior to his election, he was the Senior Director of Theology and Ethics for the Catholic Health Association of the United States. He holds a PhD in Christian Ethics from the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. He's taught in graduate programs of theology in the United States and throughout the world, including Zimbabwe, I found out tonight. He's authored 4 books in ethics. I can't even get one off the ground. He was appointed about 4 years ago, I think, 5 years ago now, as the Vatican's Pontifical Council of the Laity to be I can't even say the words, much less teach it, to be ecclesiastical assistant to the International Catholic Committee of Nurses and Medical Workers. His experience is vast. He's helped us establish our ministry also at the medical school across Forest Park. So I just want to say how grateful I am to Tom for leading us tonight.
As Father Gary said, please, if you have a question just bothering you during the talk, even if you don't like what I'm saying, even more so, let me know then. To me, the worst thing in the world is to finish the talk and have somebody raise their hand and said, on slide 2, and I haven't been able to think about anything since then, you said, now what did you mean? So please, if there's something that doesn't make sense or you want to ask or comment about, just raise your hand, or if I don't see your hand, just shout out, please. And there will be time at the end, I hope, for further conversation. As Father Gary, so I'm the provincial of the Franciscans, and why would the provincial be asked to give a talk on end of life? Probably some of my brothers would like to see the end of my life, but that's a whole different story. What's happening is that for 25 years in Chicago, I taught medical ethics and did a lot of work with hospitals in the Chicago area. And then 10 years ago, I was asked by the Catholic Health Association to be their ethicist. So ultimately, I have 38 years of experience in medical ethics, something when I was in school I never thought I would do. When I was in theology, I hated ethics. It was my worst subject. I hated it. And suddenly I was asked to go on for a doctorate in it. That's sort of how Franciscans at least used to work. You don't like it? We'll make you sure you continue school there. But I fell in love. I fell in love with medical ethics. And so what we're going to be doing today is looking at some end-of-life questions. And I would like to suggest that oftentimes the Catholic Church is seen as behind the times in an awful lot of things. I tend to think the Catholic tradition in end-of-life care has been cutting edge throughout history, and I tend to think it still is, and at least would like to offer that as a possibility to you all. And we can possibly talk about that later. So what am I going to do tonight? I hope to do 2 things. One, show us that Catholic Christian tradition, and it's a tradition, I'm going to call it Catholic, it's a tradition shared by several other Christian denominations, other religious denominations, not very far from some Jewish traditions. I've also worked closely with Muslims, and while there are differences, there are very similarities between what we say and what Islam says. So that while I'm saying Catholic, I'm not using that, I hope, as narrowing, but Catholic really means universal, so is an expanding. And then I hope maybe to offer some practical considerations as we deal with it. As Gary said, none of us are going to get out of this world alive, and so this is something we all need to think about, oftentimes for parents, sadly for some of us, even for children, but oftentimes for ourselves as well. So what does it look like? What I want to suggest is our Catholic tradition, Christian tradition, basically says that we can face death with confidence because we know that's not all there is. That's not all there is. That we believe that there is a life after death, and sometimes you couldn't guess it if you see how people treat end-of-life care. Keeping that person alive till every last ounce of life is somehow there. That's not the Catholic tradition. That's not the Catholic tradition. Catholics are a community of love, respect, support to patients and families. And I tend to think that and families is a very important thing. So often we spend so much time caring for patients, we forget to care for caregivers. And oftentimes, especially spouses, especially wives, are the forgotten people here who are doing all sorts of caregiving, and nobody ever asks, how are you doing? That's an important element. Thirdly, Catholics believe that medicine can care, has to always care, even when it cannot cure. I'm going to say more about this later. I would like to suggest, and it's changed now, but there was a time in medicine that the emphasis was only on curing. And if you couldn't cure, then you would care. Well, that makes care always second best, huh? What I want to suggest is we always care. Sometimes that care involves aggressive treatments aimed toward healing, curing. Other times it might mean simply being with the patient. And that's the most difficult, I think, for many of us, because we're fixers. We want to fix, and once we cannot fix, we sort of back away. Lastly, pain relief and suffering from suffering is important. Many, especially of certain ethnic groups within Catholics, believe that somehow you've got to suffer before you die. And I mean, oftentimes when people couldn't deal with pain relief well, they used to say, well, the time you suffer now, you won't have to suffer in purgatory. I remember my grandmother telling me that. Suffering is not a Catholic virtue, honestly. And I'd like to suggest to people there might be enough suffering in dealing with the existential questions towards the end of life that you don't have to add pain to that. These are Catholic points. And sometimes we don't realize that. I'll come back to each of those. So, how do we look upon this? Many of us are born and bred United States citizens. How many were born in this country? Yep, exactly. There are certain attitudes we have in the very marrow of our bones that we don't even think about. And part of it is this individualism that's part of who we are. Autonomy is a very good word for us. Gary said, I taught in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a communitarian culture. The saying there is in much of Africa, I am because we are. And my students in Zimbabwe, I taught medical ethics, would ask me about what is this word autonomy? When I would explain autonomy as we Americans believe it, my students' eyes would get big and their jaws would drop. Autonomy, for us, the virtue they saw is being abandoned. Abandoned by your family, abandoned by your friends. And again, I'll say more about that. And from there, we've developed this huge rights language. And rights oftentimes are my claims against you. Sadly, I think we're seeing that with the Democrats and Republicans in Washington right now. The rights language, when maybe that's not always the best language to use, especially as we're dealing with loved ones at the end of life. So dignity moves to autonomy, moves to rights. Does that make sense, what I mean by the U.S. point of view? Now, what does that do? Let's take a look at autonomy. Aren't those two pictures, wouldn't you want to know these two guys? Look at them. Aren't they really sort of stern and these are 19th century photos. Justice Horace Gray, to the left, wrote one of the most important Supreme Court opinions on autonomy. And he said, no right is held more sacred, more carefully guarded by the common law than the right of every individual to possession and control of his own person. And in the 19th century, it was definitely his own person. free from all restraint or interference from others. Autonomy. That goes to an earlier understanding. Thomas Cooley, who was a Supreme Court judge in Michigan, who simply said autonomy is the right to be left alone. Again, my Zimbabwe students would go wild with the right to be left alone. I attended a care conference once in St. Anne's Hospital, Harare, Zimbabwe. 40 people were in the room. Aunts, uncles, cousins, cousins of cousins, cousins of cousins of cousins of cousins, 40 people making the decision. And the sick person had one vote among 40. I don't know my cousins of cousins of cousins of cousins. How would, for us, that's outlandish. For Zimbabwe, that's exactly how it's supposed to be done. The family decides, not the individual. Different ways of seeing things. So autonomy, the right to be left alone. That's one thing that's very strong in us as USans. This feeling of autonomy, and this feeling that autonomy is the virtue. I'm going to go back to this at the very end of this talk and ask some questions. But the other part of who we are is technology. And again, the first time I went to Zimbabwe to teach medical ethics, 3 weeks before I went, I broke into a sweat in the middle of the night, waking up. My entire medical ethics course is based on medical technology. The one thing they don't have in Zimbabwe is medical technology. Same St. Anne's Hospital. One ventilator for the entire hospital. They're always doing triage. If somebody comes in, is put on the ventilator, and somebody with a better chance comes in, the first person is taken off the ventilator and is given to the second person. Things we don't even think about in our country. So how does technology affect how we look at end-of-life issues? Autonomy, technology, US. The use of technology is the ordinary way we do things in this country. Now, technology could be an aspirin. Technology could be a bone marrow transplant. They're both technology. To every medical question, we have a technological answer. Now, what has that done? Now, this comes from Daniel Callahan. Dan Callahan, oh my gosh, he must be in his late 80s now. Dan Callahan is the founder of the Hastings Center in New York. It is the most prominent bioethical think tank in the country. 25 years ago now, Callahan wrote a book called The Troubled Dream of Life. It is still one of the best books on end-of-life care that you could find. The Troubled Dream of Life, a tiny, tiny book, and one of the most dense books I've ever read. You can't skip a sentence because every sentence is there for a reason. What does he say? He uses a thing that he calls technological monism. Now, if you don't remember anything from this talk, remember that term technological monism. Use it in the cocktail hour afterward. All you have to say, especially in a place like WashU, is technological monism, and everybody's going to listen to you. What is technological monism? It's his description that for us, every meaningful action in medicine is technological. Whether a technological act or a technological omission. And he says, in the common mind, there is nothing natural anymore. And those of you who have dealt with loved ones at the end of life, or those of you who are physicians, there's always one more thing that can be done. Well, we'll try this, or we'll try that. There's always another thing that can be done. And therefore, there's always a technological answer until we decide to quit And then it's not doing the technology that allows the person to die, not the disease. It's not the disease, the cancer that kills a person, it's that we did not try that one more possible solution. Technological monism. Everything meaningful is technological. Whether technological act or technological omission, he ends up saying no natural cause is determinative unless we fail to deploy the technology that could deal with it. Think of the responsibility that places on us. It's not cancer that kills the patient, it's my not doing that last test. It's not the disease that kills, it's my saying enough is enough. That's not right. In fact, I remember several years ago talking to a physician who was angry that a patient's family had said enough is enough, and ultimately said, what am I going to put on the death certificate? And I said, well, what disease does the patient have? He said, cancer. Well, maybe you should put cancer on the death certificate. But it was this notion that somehow there's always something we can do, and if we don't do it, we've killed, not the disease is killed. Does that make sense? An attitude that we have, and even some of us who are professionals have that attitude. Yes?
What about when the technology fails? Does that still apply to what you are doing and not the technology?
And my thing is, maybe we shouldn't be doing it. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. Is that okay? Keep that, and if I don't answer that, please let me know, okay? That's a lot of our U.S. mentality. What about the Christian mentality? Autonomy is our strong word. In Christianity, it's care. How do we care for the patient? And again, what does care look like? Care is not necessarily doing something. Care is maybe simply being there for the patient. Now, I'm not saying care is good and autonomy is bad. We need both. When I was professor at Catholic Theological Union, I was the Erica and Harry John family professor of ethics. Now, why am I saying that? You all know Erica and Harry John. If you don't know their names, you know their product. They own this little company that's not allowed to be said in St. Louis. It's called the Miller Brewing Company. And if you remember that terrible, terrible Miller commercial, tastes great, less filling, tastes great, less filling, you remember that? And somebody finally says, stop, you're both right. It's the same thing here. Autonomy, care, stop, you're both right. I think if we look at end-of-life decisions, autonomy taken to its extreme is abandonment. My Zimbabwe students are right. But care taken to its extreme is paternalism. Now I'm going to show my age, and I know none of you would remember this, but do you remember Dr. Marcus Welby on television? Your grandparents told you about him, right? You don't remember him. What Marcus Welby did, if you remember that, it was a half-hour show, and he not only cured the patient, he cured all of the family relationships within that half hour. Do you remember? But who did it all? Dr. Marcus Welby. And if you remember the show he was in before that, it was Father Knows Best, right? Doctor Knows Best. Care can become Doctor Knows Best. Father, with a Roman collar, Father Knows Best. But think of it. These two, we need both. Stop, you're both right. Autonomy keeps care from being paternalism, if we respect the autonomy of the patient. Care keeps autonomy from being abandonment. So we need both of them. So how does that look now in the Catholic Christian religious tradition? Are we okay? Any problems, questions? We're all right? Good. So let's look at care a little bit further. we tend to use three words, and we oftentimes bring them together. Maybe we should keep them separate. Healing, curing, and caring. Curing and caring are not the same. We can care for people even when we can't cure them. Does that make sense? But I want to suggest also that healing and curing are not the same. That maybe what we need to be doing is healing more, even if that means curing less. That people with terminal diseases can be healed. They can be healed psychologically. They can be healed emotionally. They can be healed spiritually, even if they can't be cured. Does that make sense? So, maybe we need to spend more time on healing, less time on curing. What I'm not saying, however, is don't try to cure. But let's realize what's going on, and let's try to be very understanding both of the patient and of his disease. I hope that becomes more clear as we go and continue. So, what does this look like? The Catholic tradition says we have a duty to preserve life. That's one of the reasons we believe that suicide is wrong. What people do not hear enough is that duty is not an absolute duty. That duty has limits, and we're going to talk about those limits. It's an important duty, but it's a limited duty. It's an important responsibility we have for our loved ones, but it's a limited responsibility. Human life is of great value, and that's part of my own Catholic tradition. But it is limited, the Catholic Church says, to what is truly of benefit to the patient without being unduly burdensome. Benefit, burden. Now, the Catholic tradition has used the world's worst name for what I think is the world's best idea. The Catholic tradition calls this the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means. That is an awful nomenclature. Extraordinary means does not mean extraordinary medical treatments. Ordinary medical treatments can be extraordinary means if they're burdensome to a patient without being beneficial. So everything here is benefit and burden. We're going to skip that for a minute. Maybe we shouldn't. What I'm going to be described regarding ordinary and extraordinary means is a middle position. And it's a middle position. There are two extremes, each of which is wrong. One extreme is withdrawing or using technology specifically to kill a patient. That's euthanasia. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there's another type of understanding that is called medical vitalism. Sadly, this is also condemned by the Catholic Church, but it's not talked about too much. Medical vitalism are attempts to preserve the patient's physical life in and of itself without any benefit to the patient. It's simply keeping that heart beating as long as you can. That is not the Catholic position. This is what you were talking about, I think, earlier. Again, Dan Callahan, there's this feeling that if you hesitate to use science to a fullness, to give it any benefit of a doubt, you are convicted not only of failure to hope in science, but failure to respect life. That is not the Catholic position. The Catholic position is the middle position. Euthanasia, Catholics believe, is wrong. That doesn't surprise anybody here, does it? Medical vitalism, Catholics believe, is wrong. And that might surprise some people. What does this middle position look like? Again, beautiful quotes, but the world's worst title for a document, and that is the Vatican document on euthanasia. It has very little to say about euthanasia, a lot to say about what Catholics believe about life. When death is imminent, one may withhold or withdraw those treatments that would only secure a precarious and burdensome prolongation. This is not suicide, the Vatican says. It's simply accepting the human condition, accepting our limits. No person is obliged to submit to any health procedure that person is judged with free and informed consent not to provide a reasonable hope of benefit without imposing excessive risks and burdens. Any procedure. And who judges that? Who judges that? The patient, right. Yeah, well, it could be if the patient can't speak, but it's the patient first. Patient's family, power of attorney, we'll talk about that. There are many people who choose not to have a spouse as power of attorney because they're not going to do this. So let's go further. What are benefits? Benefits are very subjective to the person. Benefit might be obviously return to health. But if I am dying of cancer and my granddaughter is the first in my family to graduate from college, and she will be graduating in 10 days, and I know I cannot go to the ceremony, but she has promised and she's got permission to come in her robe and cap with the diploma in hand and show it to me. Could you see that as a benefit? Very personal. It's interestingly, if you say subjective, that sounds bad. If you say personal, that sounds okay. Benefits are personal. Burdens, the Catholic tradition has defined much more exactly, and basically four. One is excessive pain. Obviously a burden, And we have experienced that, many of us already. And again, without hope of benefit. I can go through pain if I know it's going to be over and I'm going to get well. Going through pain without that possibility is a very different thing. Great cost. We don't want to talk about cost, but cost is there. Grave inconvenience. Interesting. This is Catholic tradition. We're in St. Louis. What if the only treatment now being done is in Los Angeles? Do I have an obligation to go to Los Angeles for that treatment? What do you think? No. No. Grave inconvenience. Makes sense? The last one I think is most interesting. And I love the Latin. This is the only Latin I'm going to use the whole night, but it is vehemens horror. You could even feel it, Vehemens horror, vehement horror, psychological repugnance. From the 1600s on, theologians have said sometimes the possibility of cure is worse than death itself. A brother of mine, when I was living in Chicago, throughout his life, and would talk to us that he hopes he never has to go on dialysis because he couldn't feel ever that he could do that. He just couldn't. And sadly, as luck would have it, he ended up with end-stage kidney failure. And asked the provincial, not the provincial, said, try it. Provincials are like that. Try it. Try it. I would take him to the dialysis unit. He would not sleep the night before. Even though we had the air conditioning on in the car, he was sweating going to the unit. As he would go to the couch to have, to begin the treatment, he would literally be shaking, trembling. After a week and a half, he says, I cannot take this anymore. Vehemens horror. It was so frightening to him. He finally called the provincial, asked to stop, and now the provincial was smart. It was not the provincial's decision, it had to be his. He decided to end dialysis. Did he commit suicide? Psychological repugnance, vehemens horror. For him, now, for me, very likely, it would not be extraordinary. Huh? Same treatment. For me, very likely not. For him, definitely yes. Who discerns, who decides what's burdensome? We said who decides benefit? Who decides what's burdensome to the patient? The patient, yes. Bob?
Maybe this is the wrong time to ask this question.
Never a wrong time, but I'll just say if I'm going to do it later.
I've struggled for years about the difference between the incremental increase of morphine delivery during hospice and physician-assisted suicide.
We'll talk about that in a bit. We'll be talking about that in a minute.
Thank you.
Yes, no, that's a good question. Anybody else? We still okay? Yes.
I'm wondering about the same idea in terms of horror of the disease that you're struggling. And as a Californian, and knowing that that law is in place in my state right now, people who are, again, are saying that it's okay to choose a physician-assisted suicide
Right.
because it's that horror of, I'm thinking of the young woman in Oregon who started this whole ball rolling that into the cockiness of California, where she could not stand the idea of the pain she was going to experience because of the brain tumor that was
Right.
taking her life.
And again, I don't want to throw you off, but would you let me wait for a little bit? Much of the answer that we have is in palliative care. And so I will be talking about palliative care, and then please bring it up. And that's really close to what yours is, Bob, as well. Yes?
Is great cost just monetary costs, or could it be things like social costs?
It could be either. It depends. But normally in the tradition, it's monetary, but it could be other things. Okay? Yes? No.
How does this analysis apply to cases of dementia, particularly final stages of Alzheimer's?
Excellent question. Again, I'm going to
That's
wait. And hopefully, time will run out before I have to answer any of those questions. But, no, that will be talked about a little bit later, okay? So, if that's what we're talking about, what does this mean positively for us? We need to respect our patients. We need to respect their own points of view, and this is part of several of your questions. How do we do that? Patients should be provided with whatever is necessary to help them deal with their condition. Now, this is interestingly because in some cultures you do not tell the patient that they're dying. There's an interesting story of Francis of Assisi, which lets me know that doctor speak, I'm sorry for any physicians here, was alive and well 800 years ago. 3 months before Francis died, he went to his doctor, a man by the name of Bon Giovanni, Good John. And doctor, am I going to live or am I going to die? And the doctor says, Francis, with the grace of God, you will live. Now think about that. That's a statement that says nothing at all. With the grace of God, you will live. Of course, with the grace of God, you could live, but am I going to live or not? And so he says, basically, doctor, give it to me straight. Am I going to live or die? He says, Francis, you're going to die in 3 months. Now, he could have said that earlier, but it's, with the grace of God, all will be well. Patients need to be told the truth. And again, sadly, that's a controversial statement in this day and age. Patients need spiritual support. What is very interesting, and it's begun probably about 8-9 years ago, even longer, with people like Christine Puchalski, etc., palliative care docs, who begin acknowledging the fact that patients want to hear spirituality from their doctors. And there's a group of physicians that get together every year to talk about religion, spirituality, and medicine. Now, this does not mean you proselytize or that you sort of force spirituality down a person, But if a person wants to hear it, there is nothing unscientific about a physician talking spirituality. Patients need to be given the opportunity to prepare for death. One of the reasons we tell the truth is so they can prepare for death. And perhaps, you know, we talked about assisted suicide. Perhaps what patients really need is permission to talk about dying. Did my life have meaning? There are some advanced directives, one called 5 Wishes, which goes beyond the normal advanced directive issue, but raises questions like, who do I want to forgive before I die? Who do I feel need to forgive me before they die? Gary and I were talking about a Franciscan priest by the name of Richard Rohr earlier today. Richard Rohr talks about his mother. She was dying, and Richard, being priest, spiritual guru, Franciscan, etc., decides he's going to help deal with things, and, you know, basically brings the family into the room, and especially his mother and father, and said, Dad, I think you should tell Mom that you forgive her anything she might have done. Sure, I forgive you. Mom, I think you should tell Dad you forgive him. Mom, I think you should tell Dad. She wouldn't. The father left the room, and Richard talked to his mother. He mowed down my tulips. He did it on purpose. Richard talked to his father. His father never knew that his mother felt this way, and ultimately had that reconciliation. But there are things we might need to do that we don't even realize at the end of life. How do we get these conversations going? Good pain management is important. One of the major accomplishments in the last 15 years has been pain management. Now, sometimes it gets a little cutesy, you know, 1 to 10, or a smiley face to a frown face and all that stuff. But it's important for people to be able to say how much pain they will endure for what they want done. I want no pain at all, and I want to write the great American novel. I'm never going to write the great American novel anyway, but that's impossible. What pain am I willing to accept for what I feel I need to do? And physicians can deal with that. Most hospitals now have pain management teams. What is interesting, now, some of my research is a couple years old because now I'm provincial and I don't get to do these things as much as I would like. But it was not long ago where physicians were still prescribing the painkillers that they learned about in medical school. Good friend of mine, a Jesuit by the name of Miles Sheehan, who is a gerontologist. Franciscans do have good friends that are Jesuits. That does happen on occasion. But Miles told me that when he went to medical school, he had 1 hour of pain management. Not a 1-hour course, 1 hour of pain management. We now have professionals who understand pain management. Pain can be controlled. Sometimes that might mean inducing a coma, if that pain is so intractable. That's part of your question. Sometimes, especially at the end of life, it still means morphine. That is still one of the most effective drugs. The difficulty with morphine is that it suppresses breathing. People do get more and more and more morphine because they develop tolerance. If you end up giving so much morphine that the patient dies, the question becomes, why did you do it? If you're really honestly trying to keep the patient pain-free, and that, in doing that, causes the patient to die sooner, it's in a Roman Catholic discussion called the principle of double effect. The effect you wanted was pain management. What happened, death was foreseen but not intended. I'll be there 1 minute. What normally happens, interestingly, is if morphine is properly given, the patient's life is extended, not shortened. But within Catholic tradition, the intentionality is the important thing. Why am I doing it? Now, we can do this with a wink and a nod, too. What was his name? Dr. Kevorkian, if you remember him many decades ago, claimed that his suicide machine was pain relief. It was pain relief because the patient was dead and could no longer feel pain. That's not pain relief. What we're saying here is that in trying to give honest to goodness pain relief, that is what we ought to be doing, even though it might, I promise only lose one Latin, but beyond our intention to shorten the patient's life. That's still okay, and interestingly, factually, it tends to prolong life, not shorten it. Sir, you had a question?
How liberally do you think that like morphine and other pain killers should be used? Because it seems to me like some of the greatest saints suffered indescribable pain, and Christ obviously suffered, and there's a particular beauty in that suffering. So
We are always, end of life is, there's always going to be suffering involved in end of life. It doesn't have to be pain, though. Probably the existential suffering we're going to feel is, has my life had meaning? Do people care? Will there be anything after I die? So there is that. And much of our tradition regarding pain and suffering developed at times when we could not deal with pain. But pain is not suffering. And I tend to think there's going to be enough suffering at the end of life that you don't have to add pain to it. Does that make sense? But you're right. And in our tradition, and oftentimes there are still questions regarding pain that cannot be dealt with. That's happening less and less now. Good? Yes?
I wonder if in your model of 40 people around a person,
Right.
the collective pain of those 40 people surpasses
Could very well.
all pain. And that is something that has to be recognized, because Richard Rohr and Thomas Keating also say, when you have meaning in pain, you have hope to heal.
Precisely.
Because the psychological and the imbalance of that, like we studied Enneagram and Myers-Briggs and a lot of stuff, we know there's meaning in making different choices to affect their life.
No, I agree. I agree with you totally. There's nothing I could add. Having said this, there are some other questions that involve. We talked about pain management, even with morphine, even though the fact that it suppresses breathing can be done. It honestly depends on why it's being done. And let's not pretend. Let's be honest with this. The other question was regarding assisted suicide. I'm very strongly believe that if we truly are with people, present to people, assisted suicide is not the answer. It used to be 15 years ago that the proponents of assisted suicide talked about pain as the major reason for this. That's no longer the case because of palliative care. The two reasons given by people who choose assisted suicide today are autonomy. I can do it, therefore I ought to be able to do it, and I don't want to be a burden to others. I'm nervous about that autonomy question, as I said before. And not be a burden to others. I think sadly that this shows the very individualistic understanding in our country. The Christian tradition is a communitarian one, and we need one another. And sir, you just talked about suffering. We need to see people able to show their dignity even in suffering. Being a burden to others, I honestly believe when I was a little baby, I was quite a burden to my parents. I'm glad they didn't decide that I was too much of a burden to them. I think as people get old, we need to show them that they are not a burden, or maybe better in a more Christian sense, we are called to bear one another's burdens. And so to me, that's much more how I would hope we would deal with things, rather than saying, after a certain point in time, that's it, I'm going to check out. Yes?
Tom, when you said autonomy, the other thought that came to my mind was something a colleague shared with me, and that was in the face of our culture where autonomy is so important, our message as Catholics is that our life is not ours. We are stewards of our lives.
Right.
And that was just, that opened up a whole door for me that I needed spiritually to think again about how seductive it is to think that my life is mine.
Right.
As opposed to it was a gift in which I steward my life.
Everybody heard that? One of the things, almost the very last slide I'm going to show, I tend to think part of how we treat one another is a problem. We're told autonomy, 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 autonomy. At the end of life, we're going to experience dependence, and we're not prepared for it. And I tend to think that's something we've got to talk about, and we will a little bit. Yes?
I'd like just to add a comment to that, if I might.
Sure.
I've worked in hospitals and nursing homes, and one of the most common things said to me is, "Oh, I don't want to bother them by asking
Precisely.
for help."
Precisely.
Universally.
Oh, exactly. I agree with you.
ask for help, even when people are being taken, and it is their exclusive job to
To hold them right. Rugged individualism, sadly. I'm going to talk a little bit about advanced. Yes, sir.
You said the two main reasons are
Autonomy, I can choose it, and not being a burden.
What about losing identity through like Alzheimer's and losing their minds?
Interestingly, now, usually when they ask these questions, these are people who can answer them. So that's not on the list that's usually given.
But for people that
That's a good question. I think that is, but what's interesting is by the time you experience it, my mother died of Alzheimer's. By the time you experience that, you don't know that that's what you're experiencing. It's that middle stage when you know that's the problem. But that's a good point. That's a good point. Advanced directives. Those of you who are old enough, like me, would know that at one point in time, the Catholic Church said no to advanced directives. Now, there's a reason for that. Advanced directives were begun in California by what is now called Compassion and Care, which used to be called the Hemlock Society. It was a pro-euthanasia group. And in our usual Catholic think, if a pro-euthanasia group says yes, what is the Catholic Church going to say? No. That's why we said no. And then we began realizing that even though we might not like the Hemlock Society, maybe those documents are still important. Interestingly, I'm a religious. Guess what is not in the Constitution? The Constitution says not one word about a religious superior. In 1976, there was a Marianist brother, Brother Fox, who had hernia surgery, and I love this, the way it always says, in an otherwise uneventful surgery, he suffered a stroke. Now, I kind of think that's a big event, you know? And ultimately ended in a coma. Brother Fox had told his religious superior, that he does not want any extraordinary means, and he understood exactly what that meant. So the religious superior told the doctor, who had been talking to him the whole time, Brother Fox doesn't want anything more done, remove all the tubes. And the doctor, who's been talking to him for weeks, and who are you? Are you his brother? Well, in religion, are you his blood brother? Are you his father? Are you his son? None of those things fit. So for religious, we need something like an advance directive, or our communities cannot help us. So interestingly, suddenly the Catholic Church says, maybe this is not a bad idea. Two kinds of advance directives: living will, durable power of attorney. Living will is simply a statement that I do not want extraordinary means when I face the end of life. The difficulty with the living will document is it's too vague. What does that mean? And doctors are very nervous about it because it could be interpreted in different ways. So the more acceptable document now have many names: healthcare proxy, but durable power of attorney is usually the generic name. This not only says what I want, but it gives a person's name that the doctor can go to. Sister Colleen is my agent. When I can no longer speak for myself, she will speak for me. Doctors like that, for good reason. Accepted by the Catholic Church, no problem at all. Patients identified in advance a representative to make healthcare decisions as a surrogate in the event that the person loses the capacity to make decisions or to communicate them. The agent is exercising what is technically called substituted judgment. The agent is supposed to have spoken to the patient beforehand and says not what I think is best for the patient, but what the patient wanted. It's a transmitted decision. It's what the patient told me he or she wants. Now that can get complicated. And sadly, sometimes we're not very clear. I know talking, well, actually, I had this experience in a hospital in Chicago where the patient told her daughter, who was her agent, I don't want any tubes. I never want any tubes. Well, the doctor forgot to tell the patient that guess what they're going to have when they get out of surgery? Tubes. The daughter went ballistic. Mom said no tubes. But this is temporary. Mom said no tubes. So we have to be a little bit more specific, and sadly the doctor probably should have been a little bit more specific. And oftentimes these could be temporalized. We will have these tubes for 3 days. If it doesn't get better, we take them out. But there are ways, but sadly sometimes we say things that we really don't mean. We say things we really don't mean. But we should say what the patient wants, not what I want for the patient. I think, now I haven't seen this statistic recently, but at one point I think that 25% of spouses did not have their spouse as their agent. Why? Because they knew the spouse would not do what they wanted the spouse to do. And many of you are nodding your heads right now. Questions to ask. Who will be my agent? Somebody who shares my values. What do I want? Do I want others involved in medical care decisions? I am, because I'm a medical ethicist, I'm the agent for many of my fellow Franciscans. Well, many have told me, and I have their address, that they want me to talk to their brother, their sister, etc., but that I'm the one who makes the decision. And this brother and sister are at least supposed to know about that. So, I make the decision, but it might be my talking to others before I tell the doctor what is to be done. What medical treatments do I want? What don't I want? And I always suggest to people, do not make a huge list of stuff you don't want, because trust your agent. And if you don't trust your agent, find another agent. Because what I say no to might be the one thing I actually need for a temporary point in time to get over an illness. So be careful about what you're saying, what you don't want. Where do I keep my advanced directives? Not in a safe deposit box. That's happened. Interestingly, many have them either on their refrigerator doors or in their refrigerators. EMS people are trained to look in refrigerators. It's true. So you know, don't put them in a place that's not easily accessible. Yes. Yes, that's a good idea. You know, have it in the wallet. Right. Give it to your doctor. If there's a hospital you would likely go to, hospitals will keep them on file. So yes, more rather than few is helpful, but your agent needs to have the original, or at least one of the originals that's actually signed. What decisions can my agent make? Again, more rather than less, I would say. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to mention that I've heard too, like, identify your circle of care and let all those people know
Precisely.
what you want, because sometimes someone might be out of town that you've communicated with, or the record might not always be in the patient's record.
Precisely, exactly.
Maybe being able to talk about it.
You're exactly right. Two things there. One, being able to talk about it. I think to me, the most important part of this is it gives people a chance to talk about things they normally would not talk about. So talk about it. Yeah. And you talked about Circle of Friends. Now this sounds stupid, but please tell your agent that that person is your agent. Many times agents have been called, and that's the first time they know they're the agent. That is not helpful. And especially, what you need are the conversations so that they know your values. What if I change my mind? Rip it up, write void, etc. Write a new one. New date counteracts the 50 that you sent to your friends before that. Yes. Yes, it is. A durable power, thank you. A durable power of attorney is a legal document. Now, what's interesting is that most states, if you look at the law, spend more time talking about how they need to be witnessed than what is to be in them. Some states, Missouri, some states need them notarized. I don't know if Missouri needs financial. Does Missouri also need? Yes. Some have two witnesses. Some have one. And anybody who could make anything from your death cannot be a witness. So your daughter, your son could be your agent, but they cannot be the witness. Your physician cannot be the witness. The idea is to make sure you're not being coerced into doing this. Yes?
What about a tattoo or a chip like they did with
That has not, to my notion, that has not been allowed in the state until now. And probably best because it's going to be really difficult to change that if you ever want to. I know, but painfully. Must the healthcare providers follow it? Yes, but. Two things about that but. One is that if you're asking for something illegal, such as assisted suicide in Missouri, they're not going to follow it. Secondly, there is no sanction for a physician that does not follow it. They're supposed to, but the law has never had sanctions for physicians that do not follow it.
And even are the EMTs trained? In other words, if you have someone elderly and they fall, get hurt, and there's clearly a they're trained
To resuscitate anyway, precisely, the EMS. Right. How do you get past, the question was, EMS are trained to do it. How do you get past that? By not calling the EMS. Here's where hospice groups are very important. They will tell you to call them instead of the EMS. But see, EMS have to do it because they are not physicians. They by law have to stabilize somebody and then move them to a hospital, where the hospital can end up deciding what to do, but they by law have to stabilize somebody. So sadly, I mean, it's this awful sounding thing, but you deal with it by not calling the EMS. But that means have somebody else to call. Have somebody else to call. Yes, sir. And in some ways, it's the same thing. The question, in certain situations, EMS is to stabilize the patient, to move them on. And so, in some ways, you're asking somebody to do the exact opposite of what they've been trained to do. But and ORs have much, at least to my knowledge, have much more discretion than EMS do. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to follow. And oftentimes, in the OR, they don't have the advance directive. I don't want this to go too long, so there's just a couple more things I want to say. There's a new document that is not an advance directive that is constantly being talked about now. It's either called POLST in most states, the Physician's Orders for Sustaining Treatment, or in Missouri and Kansas, it's called TPOPP, the Transportable Physician Order for Patient Preferences. Right now, 80% of people die from chronic debilitating disease. And depending upon the disease, there are very obvious trajectories of that disease. Many cancers that are terminal, the patient is on a plateau for most of the disease, and at the very end, a rapid decline. Other diseases like Alzheimer's is almost a diagonal line going down. Diseases like COPD, etc., is almost a roller coaster. Up and down, up and down, up and down. You have an episode, you get better, but not as good as you were, and you're like that till another episode, you go down, and you go up again, but not as much as you were, and one of those episodes is going to kill you. It's just people do not know which it is. Because these trajectories are known by physicians, because most people now die of chronic debilitating disease, the POLST allows patient preferences to be turned into an existing order. That's a physician order that has to be followed. And again, this needs to be part of what's called advanced care planning. You need to speak with physicians, family, etc. And that at the beginning of an illness, you're going to probably say in the POLST order, do everything. At one point, you might say, these are the things to do, these are the things not to do. And towards the end, as those peaks get smaller and smaller and smaller, do not, comfort care only. But as a physician's order, they carry more weight. They are not a legal document. This is a physician's order, carry more weight because there's a physician signature on it. There was a hand up. Yes. Surely, no, exactly. And one thing with the POLST, or the TPOPP, POLST is easier to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to say POLST, is that it needs to be updated constantly. It is not once and for all. So anytime there's, say, a critical incident, physician, family, patient need to talk again. So one of the things about POST or the TPOPP is that on the backside, there are places to update it constantly. But you're exactly right, this needs to be constantly looked at. And that's why what's more important than the form is the planning sessions with physician, family, and patient.
All right, before we start, I mentioned my wife's mother was 100 years old, and so on any given day, we're not facing these types of
Precisely.
decisions. But at the same time, there is no doubt that she is ready to go, even though, her 100 years is basically good health. But what, can you say a few words about dealing with people that's just old age? And for instance, if she were to be told she had pneumonia tomorrow, I'm not sure she would want anyone.
And that's valid. Pneumonia used to be called the old person's friend. Sadly, and again, this is Daniel Callahan, and it's somewhat cynical. Contemporary medicine has saved us from quick dying diseases so that we could linger in our diseases. Example, the person has bone cancer and suddenly has a heart attack. It's a valid question as to whether the heart attack should be treated or whether the person should be allowed to die. Pneumonia the same way. And in many of the advanced directives, there's the question of, at a certain point, will antibiotics be used? That's a valid question. That's back to burdensome benefit. Those are valid questions that can be asked. There's a certain difficulty in keeping somebody free from diseases that kill you quickly so that you could end up in a long, painful disease. This does not sound like a loving God, does it? So those are valid questions, but what needs to be done are the conversations beforehand. We don't presuppose what the patient's answer might be, but those are valid. Those are valid. Yes?
Who helps in making informed decisions when everyone knows that they're going to be like bleeding tubes or certain invasive treatments?
What? Very good. There's a document in the Catholic Bishop's Hand, which is not a bad document, called the Ethical and Religious Directives. One of the things they say there is neither the physician nor the patient acts independently. They've got to work together. The duty of the physician is to explain in best terms the trajectory of illnesses. That's what they're supposed to be doing. The duty of the patient and the family is to talk about what their values are. And then together they need to see how those two come together. That's what's supposed to happen, but you're right, it doesn't always. A couple more, then honestly we'll be done. Post, it's a tool. It could be used well or badly. The worst way to use these forms is simply to fill out a form. It has to be part of conversation. All of these things ought to be part of a conversation. The greatest danger is, just another routine form to be completed and separated from advanced care planning. And we need not do it once and for all. I was looking as provincial over some of my brother's advanced directives, and I found one where both of the agents of this brother, since one of my brothers is here, I'm never going to mention the guy's name, both have been dead for 10 years. So the last time he looked at that form, that's not helpful. So to keep these things updated. Organ donation. Organ donation is valid within the Catholic Church. Pope Benedict, before he was Pope, had an organ donor card. When he became Pope, they said he couldn't. I don't know if, I guess they did not want somebody running around with the Pope's kidney. I don't know, but he had to give it up. But he was an organ donor before he became Pope. The only thing is to make sure that no conflicts of interest occur, so that, for example, the group that retrieves the organ is not the same group places the organ into the patient who needs it, so that there's no conflict of using one person for the health of another. And here's the last part. Preparing for death. It goes back to the Middle Ages. In fact, the great Franciscan Saint Bonaventure would say it all the time. We die the way we live. We die the way we live. The art of dying that was developed in the 1500s, the Latin ars moriendi, was an understanding that at death we reaffirm the life we have always embraced, that there are temptations at the end of life to change from the root of virtue, and that what we need to do is reaffirm those virtues. What I find difficulty today is that the virtues we affirm during life are not going to help us at death. Back to autonomy. Autonomy might be the worst thing we have to go into death. There are two authors, one Catholic, one Calvinist, one dead, one still alive. The Catholic who's alive is Chris Vogt, V-O-G-T, who wrote a book on the art of dying. The Protestant Calvinist good friend is Alan Verhey, who taught at Duke University. Both wrote books on end of life, what we need at the end of life. Both ended up from very different traditions with the same conclusion. We need patience. Patience is something that we're not taught very well. And what patience is for them is learning to be attentive to God's presence. Learning to be attentive to God's presence. To understand our dependence. One of you mentioned dependence early on in this conversation. Notice what we're told, be individual, stand for yourself, stand for yourself, stand for yourself, stand for yourself. Suddenly, how are we going to be dependent? How are we going to be dependent? In a lot of ways, my African students knew this better than I did. And perhaps as church, what we could help one another with is to be dependent. But if others are to be dependent, each of us needs to be dependable. Huh? So we need to bear one another's burdens. Yes?
How about changing to interdependence?
Interdependence, perfect. Exactly, interdependence. But I think at the very end of life, it is dependence.
No, but Mr. Thompson earlier.
Well, precisely. Earlier, we need interdependence. I exactly agree with you totally, ma'am. And to develop a sense of limits. One of the things we're not very good at as Americans is limits. And I think we're seeing some of that again in what's going on right now. Finally, our responsibility. Accept our mortality. What an odd thought. Accept our mortality. Develop a sense of limits and use advanced directives and use them well. The Catechism, I don't usually quote the Catechism of the Catholic Church, but the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and it's an easy one to remember, 2288, is one of the best paragraphs. Life and physical health are precious gifts entrusted to us by God. We must take reasonable care of them. Reasonable care. Extraordinary, ordinary, all that. Reasonable care. Now notice what they say. Taking into account the needs of others and the common good. Those of you who are physicians here, how many times does a patient come into you asking you how their care is going to affect the common good? Those of you who are not physicians, how often did you go into a physician's office and ask how your care is going to affect the common good? That's something we don't think about, but it might be something we ought to. Yes?
Real quick, I really commend whoever got the new intern here, named Sarah. She spoke at the 9 o'clock mass to my confirmation and the whole thing. That gives me hope. She admitted it. She admitted what anxiety, depression did to her.
Mm-hmm.
And I've outlived so many of my doctors. I'm only 69. Doctors.
You young kid, you.
Doctors are telling you
Sure.
record numbers.
Precisely. No, exactly.
We need, like you and Father, who's really very humble, because you're touching our heart and soul with spirituality. I think the people in Kenya know we have way too much materialism. We're too much keeping up.
Sure. You're not going to get an argument from me. Last one, very last one now. I'm a Franciscan. Francis died There are two stories about his last words. The one that we always quote is, "I have done what is mine to do, my Christ teach you what is yours." I think that's a very good thing for us to think about. The other thing he said was, "I want a cookie." As he was dying and the friars asked him, "Is there anything we could do for you?" He said, "Yeah, there was this Roman lady who made these little almond cookies." He asked if possible that he could have one. Well, as the story goes, I mean, this is going to come as a shock to you. In the 1200s, there was not a fast train between Rome and Assisi. But as he asks this, suddenly Lady Jacoba appears. She had come up from Rome to give, and she asked, "Do you think Francis would like one of these cookies?" So Francis had the cookie before he died. Sorry about that. Have any of you ever been to Assisi? Quite a few. The Basilica of St. Francis has 3 levels. The very bottom level is the Tomb of Francis. What people don't oftentimes realize is if you go down the steps, there's another little casket, and that's Lady Jacoba. So she's buried in the same crypt as Francis. Yes. Yes?
So sense of limits. So what is our ethical dilemma or thing we have to think about when Uncle Leo, we could give Uncle Leo 6 more months of life. He has cancer, he's going to die. But we give him 6 more months of life and we spend $500,000 to grant this thing, but he's going to die. And what's the ethical decision around the health treatments? I don't call it health care system, the health treatment system of
The questions we have to ask, and it shouldn't be the question that your Uncle Leo has to ask. It's a question we need to ask as a community. What are the limits we're going to accept, and what are the trade-offs we're going to do? It shouldn't be the physician at the bedside. It shouldn't be your Uncle Leo there. But somebody has to ask those questions. Interestingly, in Europe, much more care is given at the beginning of illnesses than we give, and less care at the end. We do it the opposite. If you take a look at most Medicare disbursements, much money is spent in the last 6 months of life. Much money. I don't want to say that's not good, but if it's not helping the patient, is it good? I think we need to have those conversations, and it shouldn't be your Uncle Leo who has to decide. Gary.
Tom, what's the teaching on removing feeding tubes?
Feeding tubes, at the end of life, which I'm talking about, it is to be used the same way as any other treatment, what is burdensome or beneficial to the patient. No difference. Pope John Paul II gave a talk in March of 2004 that everybody says, quotes, that you cannot take them out. He was speaking about a particular situation called the persistent vegetative state and raised questions regarding whether a patient who is not imminently dying, whether feeding tubes should be taken out. That's still controversial. He said no. There are other people who say yes. So there's still controversy with that. But even for I can't even talk now, he said at the end of life, it's the same way as everything else, burden and benefit. And who decides? The patient decides, not physician, not the Pope, not me, it's the patient. And that's what the church says. Yes?
So you talked a fair bit about how like the interplay of autonomy and care and like as far as affects the patient's fears, how it will affect others. How would you respond when like patients are scared of how it will affect themselves, like when they're in a situation where they're facing lost identity, whether it be in the early stages of dementia or Alzheimer's, or facing pain management processes that may like put them into a coma or put them on very intense pain medications?
And here's where, again, I would still talk about the community. That even in those, if all I'm dealing with is myself as an individual, there's no purpose to my going on. But if we're talking about a community, there very well still might be a purpose for others. In fact, it's part of your question. This becomes part of the suffering question too. There might be reasons for me not to have assisted death because it might be something I need to teach somebody else. So I would still suggest that it is not appropriate for me to use assisted suicide, because what has also been is how that does affect everybody else, how that affects other people. But that's definitely a faith perspective. But that's fine. I'm a man of faith. So, yeah. Yes. And maybe this will be the last one. Is that okay? We can still, wait, there's one more question after you. Was there another? Okay, two more questions. Is that all right? Yes. Or comments?
I'll bring up Alzheimer's again. Even in terms of when I've spoken with families when it's been not end of life, but it's possibly going to be another 3 or 4
Sure.
years. But it comes a time when the person is unable to eat or is not eating, and the question becomes, are we having people trying to force them to eat? Are we allowing them to eat what some people see as disgusting mush because it has to be an altered texture or liquids? How does that fall into benefit versus or?
No, that's a good question, and it fits in exactly the way other things do. So, forcing a patient to eat, no. Sadly, sometimes Alzheimer's patients might have catheter or something, so they're tied down. That's no. I mean, we need to respect the patient, and to be able to help a patient by, helping them eat is one thing. Forcing them is another. There we respect the patient, and if that means the patient will get less nourishment, if that means the patient might die earlier, we're not doing it to kill the patient, we're doing it to show respect. That's still a possibility. And they can't? Precisely. Aspersion pneumonia is very real. We do not force them to do something that they don't want to do. And interestingly, part of Alzheimer's is even forgetting how to swallow. So that we respect that. We don't necessarily do artificial feeding to that patient. And interestingly, it's not been shown that even extends life. So that what we do is respect it, and we do what we can. We're still there, we're with the patient. We try. If they say no, we respect that. So and sometimes it's more difficult for us, obviously, than it is for the patient. One last question.
In support of your suggestion,
Account.
you can advance the right to, usually when patients' family members disagree, it's the person who wants to be most aggressive who wins, and usually it's the person who lives furthest away.
Precisely. And happens to be the lawyer. In Illinois, they called it the daughter from California syndrome. Perhaps in California they call it the son from Missouri syndrome. I don't know, but you're exactly right. And it's usually the patient or the person who is farthest away who's probably not talked to mom or dad for the past 5 years, and now is going to prove that they still love their parent in the worst possible way. Okay. Thank you all, and I hope this has been a little bit helpful. One last thing. I almost forgot. I was at CHA, and I'll give these to Father Gary. I developed 3 guides. The first one is expressing your healthcare wishes about advanced directives. The second is about caring for people at the end of life, the Catholic Church's teaching. These were done with I worked in conjunction with physicians, nurses, etc. And the last one, palliative and hospice care, caring even when we cannot cure. They're available in this format. I feel very proud. Close to 100,000 of each of these have been sold. A lot of hospitals have gotten them, Catholic hospitals. The other is that they're downloadable from the Catholic Health Association website, CHAUSA, www.chausa.org. My favorite story, as I told Father Gary, is with the palliative care. We have a young 20-year-old in a graphic agency who helped me with this. As we dealt with palliative care, the very first, all these have lots of pictures, the first set of pictures had people that were at least 180 years old. And I said, no, we want some young people. Because young people get sick too, honestly. And so the second draft, they had young people all helping people that were 180 years old. And we finally got a quasi-young person here who's still not quite young, but is a whole lot younger than this 20-year-old. I don't think, honestly thought that 20-year-olds could possibly die. So that was a very interesting experience for me too. But anyway, thank you all. These will be here with Father Gary, and you could also download them from the Catholic Health Association website free. Thank you all, and see you upstairs.